I have here what's called a Newton's cradle. This is a very powerful piece of modern technology developed in the last few hundred years. And you'll notice that if I take this ball over here and I let it go, that the other one on the other end and this one seem to interact, but the ones in the middle just kind of carry the energy from one side to the other. The idea here is that by moving this one over here on this side, I can affect that one over on that side, but that when I do, that one comes back and affects this one. And the ones in the middle are getting affected as well because they're transmitting all of the energy through them somehow. And this can act as an excellent analogy for our minds for the power of indirect influence. Because what's happening here is I'm directing this one over here on this side indirectly. Okay, it's going through all of the three in the middle before it gets over there. Does that make sense? And then that one comes back and it affects this one indirectly, and they keep indirectly affecting each other. But even though they're indirectly affecting each other, they're the ones that are obviously being affected the most. The ones in the middle are just middlemen, so to speak. And the effect from the first one comes back and keeps affecting it, and then it goes back and it affects the other one. You follow? So this is a great visual analogy for indirect influence. Okay, for indirect influence. And it's also a great simple visual analogy for how systems work. And this is kind of the instant gratification version, because I get to see that when I let this ball go, that it immediately affects the other one on the other end, and then that one immediately comes back and affects this one. So this is a great visual analogy, except that in the real world it doesn't work like this, and in our minds it doesn't work like this, that these connections are multitude. The effects are not simple like this, the cause-effect relationship, and they're separated by time and space. Okay, the actions and the reactions, so to speak. But if we remember this principle of indirectly influencing, it will take us far. These things are cool because you can also do things like take two of the balls and let them go and watch what happens. Two of them indirectly influencing two others. But this is where it really gets fun. Can you see where this is going? And there are other combinations that you can do with this. Now, this is just a cheap toy, so it's obviously not perfectly calibrated to exacting standards. This just gives you, again, it's like a map that allows you to then be able to relate to what's, quote unquote, really going on. Does that make sense? Indirect. Elements mutually interdependent, mutually affecting each other. Actions having the reaction be way down the path, and that experience recursion, so they come back and each action comes back, so each cause is also an effect, and each effect is also a cause. And every element part of the system, unable to escape from being affected by actions and reactions, all bound up together. Pick up yours. Now have some fun. If you actually leave it on the floor. You might be able to get, a little bit more stability. Obviously, since this is a small one, it doesn't have the mass and the momentum and so forth with the bigger one, but it gives you the little bit of the effect that you get to see. You get to see how it works. There are a lot of cool little experiments you can do with this. Here, try this. Watch this one. Yeah, exactly. Take both ends and pull them out. See this? Whoa, whoa. Or grab two on both sides. Similar effect. I gotta stand straight here so I can let them go a little bit more straight. Huh? You getting this? Let three go on one side and two on the other. Pull them apart like this. Three on one side, two on the other. Family dynamics. It gets cool when you start like messing with it while it's doing its thing, and see a lot of different interesting effects. You can see patterns visually with it. It's cool. In this section, we're going to talk more about how the mind works. We're going to delve deeper into some of the ideas that we've been presenting to you here. Later in the program, we'll talk about systems and what's called emergence. But for now, what I'd like to point out is that the mind, in a way, is very similar to this Newton's cradle toy, in that you can have a complex set of interactions happening, and yet somehow it's all one thing. Okay? If I'm this ball over here, and I'm going back and forth, and I'm clicking back and forth, I'm having the experience of moving around kind of independently. And I might even see that I'm running the show from that perspective. But from our perspective, from out here, it's all one thing interacting with itself. You follow me? Does that make sense to you? Two different perspectives. One being the ball, one sitting outside and looking at the toy. Well, as you heard from Steven Pinker, how the mind works, the mind can be thought of almost like the body, in that we have a whole bunch of different organs in our body all working together, but we just experience it as a body until something goes wrong, until something calls attention to it, or in the case of the stomach, until we get hungry. And it says, no, give me food. Now, what happens when the stomach says, no, I'm hungry, give me food? Something interesting happens. That part of us takes over for a moment. And it, for a moment, becomes the ball that's running the show. Okay, it takes over the whole system. Well, our mind does the same thing. Okay, so our mind is running, and the perception is it's all one thing. One mind, I'm one personality. I've got one thought going through my conscious mind, because it seems that we can hold about one thought in our conscious mind at one time. We can switch them up. We can take one and then think of another, and then we can merge the two and make one new one. But for most people, the experience is one thought going through at a time. It all seems like one toy. It all seems like one body, even though there are many, dozens of primary mechanisms, maybe 100 main mechanisms, potentially, depending on whose theories you're looking at, 1,000 or more total. Different pieces of machinery that are all operating, all keeping this in homeostasis, all in a big system, balancing together, creating this experience of mind. And what Wyatt and I have been teaching you here are some of the different ways that these elements interact. Sometimes external elements come and interact with the mind. Sometimes internal elements interact with the mind, direct it. We've really been trying to point to how this whole thing occurs. But the takeaway here is that all these elements are behaving, trying to do their thing to keep us in balance, to keep the mind running smoothly, to keep us on track, to keep us managing. And the mechanism that I want to talk about right now that helps us to manage this whole process and keep us sane and keep us on track is the mechanism of self-deception. Self-deception. And to get to self-deception, I want to talk a little bit about how our senses work. So we have 5 primary senses. And in their approximate order of evolution, they are touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. Why is it important to think of their approximate order of evolution? I think it's just somewhat enlightening to notice that touch evolved because, hey, something bumped up against you, and if you didn't know that it was bumping up against you, you might have gotten eaten. And so touch is important. Or if you bumped up against something that might be a good potential mate, you'd want to know that. So we have touch. Most of this stuff is rooted in survival and reproduction. And then, as we were bumping up against other creatures and potential food and dangers and high and low temperature and things that could hurt us, we became more and more sensitive in our touch, and eventually we started to get chemical receptors so that when we touched, we could know more than just that it was there, we could actually taste it. So taste, in a way, is just a much more sensitive form of touch, right? Looked at from a certain perspective. And smell is related to taste, right? You've probably heard that someone that loses their sense of smell loses a lot of their taste sensitivity because they work together in tandem. Actually, all of our senses do. We don't notice that either. And in a way, smell is chemically sensing molecules, compounds, at a distance. So smell, in a very real way, is tasting from a distance. It's like that chemical taste, then just, right? Instead of having to actually have our tongue or a chemical feeler up against the thing, we could become so sensitive to it, our tongue could be a millimeter away, and we could still get a little bit of the taste. Have you ever smelled something that was so strong that you could taste it later? You know what I'm talking about? So now we could taste from a distance, we could smell. And then, if you think about it, hearing, what is hearing? Hearing is the bone in our ear, the little bones in there, and the hairs that pick up vibrations at different frequencies. So we have different lengths of hair that literally vibrate in resonance with different frequencies inside of our ear. And so a low frequency vibration, like you'd hear from a subwoofer, like a boom, boom. It's that really low vibration you can feel. Like you may have been standing in front of a loudspeaker at some point, and you look down and you see your clothing vibrating. That's a very low frequency. And frequency means how fast it's vibrating. So a 20 hertz frequency, 20 hertz vibration is literally vibrating 20 times a second. So standing in front of a big speaker that vibrates really low bass, you can see your clothing vibrating. It's actually resonating. If it's at 20 hertz, it's 20 times a second. And it goes up higher and higher all the way to the top end of human hearing is about 20 kilohertz, which is the highest level of kind of like very high sibilant kind of frequencies. So we pick these up in our ears. What is it? It's all just vibration, which is feeling stuff at a distance. It's feeling the movement of things at a distance, which is, again, kind of like a touching. It's kind of an abstracted sense of touch. And vision, okay, which is the master stroke of perception, it seems to me. What's vision? Vision is literally radiation detection. And we think that we're seeing, whatever that means. But all we're doing is we're detecting light. We're detecting radiation. Right? The sun, that's what it gives off, is radiation, light. We have radiation detection modules in our skull, and we detect all the radiation bouncing off of things, and then it goes into our brain and we decode it. And what is sight? Well, it's kind of like touching something at a distance because the photons are coming in and touching our eyes, bouncing off the thing, right? So every photon that comes into your eye from looking at your hand is bouncing off of your hand, right? When you look up at the moon and you see it at night, every photon that's hitting your eyes that you can use to make that picture of the moon is bouncing off the moon. It's coming from the sun, bouncing off the moon and going to your eyes, all of them. So it's, in a way, like touching something at a distance. That's why I think it's interesting to pay attention to the evolution of these things, because you can see the direction of how things are going. But there's something else that I find interesting about how we sense things, and that is that we think that when we reach out and we touch something, like I'm touching this or I'm touching this, or we use our mouth to taste something, or our nose to smell something, or our ear to hear it, or our eye to see it, we think, we experience that we're perceiving it directly. And that's the natural way of perceiving. That it is, like, these papers are in my hand. I can feel them. I'm feeling them directly. We think that when we taste something, that we're tasting it directly, smelling, hearing. We think that it's really the way that it is, like we're really perceiving it. But what we don't realize is that there's actually something more akin to a complex computer system going on, and that as each sense pulls in its data using nerves and using all kinds of interesting equipment that we have in our heads, that it's just signals coming in. And we're just reading a little band of those signals, the one that was useful for our survival and reproduction, and that we're missing most of the equation. Okay, so when we use our eyes and we see a little bit of the spectrum. We don't see the whole thing. A good example is infrared. Okay, many animals can see in infrared. If you take a flower, this is a relatively recent discovery. You take a flower and you look at it and you go, wow, it's a beautiful flower. Maybe I should pick that and put it in my kitchen. and then some bugs come and fly, and you say, oh, they're coming for the nectar or whatever. Well, you take a picture of the flower with an infrared camera, and all of a sudden you see it has this complex pattern in it that humans can't see. But bugs look at it and go, hey, that looks like a sexy other bug. Right? So we don't see that. Well, all of these senses are, and I'm generalizing, but they're a perception of vibration at some frequency. And you can actually map them. Okay, so sound, you can hear 20 vibrations a second. It sounds like this very low, it doesn't even sound it's this super low rumble, and you can kind of feel it too. And that's the little spectrum we can hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And then vision is in a certain band of the light spectrum. There are all these big gaps that are missing along our perception spectrum. We're just missing it. This isn't self-deception. This is, we don't have the equipment to pick it up. We're just not wired to even be able to perceive it. So right now, all kinds of signals are going through you. Okay, every kind of wave that there is are coming into, hitting you, going through you. And we're adding more every day with all the satellites going around our planet, all the cell phone towers, the cellular phones that are everywhere. And it probably is affecting our systems. Okay, we don't know how, but there are going to be implications. There are implications to this. So when you take your phone, you pick up your cell phone and you say hello, or you use your computer and you're connected to the internet, you can't perceive what's going on to make that work. Okay? If someone picks up their phone and calls you, you don't just go, oh, let me tune my mind to that frequency. Hello? You need a phone to decode it because it's operating outside of your systems, so to speak. And so that's one level of awareness of there's a lot going on that we don't have the equipment to perceive. Some people would say, well, that's not relevant. I'd say, well, it's not relevant. Well, then stop using your phone. Stop using the internet if it's not relevant. It's very relevant, actually. But none of us know how any of that stuff works. And we just say, oh, other people do that. And I think that that's relatively benign. Like, I don't need to know how to go build a generator or build a computer server to use the internet. That's probably not practical. We'll let some other professionals do that. But this is just an analogy, because the real challenge is much closer to home. And the real challenge is that when we take in the information from our little narrow band sensors on the frequencies that we're equipped to detect on, touch, taste, smell, hearing, vision, we're not seeing the way things are. We're actually taking the information in, decoding it on our brains, and then manufacturing, creating, and projecting out a version, like a movie projector, and then we're saying, that's real. So when I look at my hand right now and all the photons are bouncing off these lights and off my hand and into my eye, right? My natural gut is to go, oh yeah, I see my hand. That's exactly the way my hand looks. What I can't see, what I'm not aware of, is my mind decoding all of that information, making this image of my hand, and then literally projecting it out into space so I can perceive it right there. You follow me on this? Yep. So when we hear something rustling in the brush over there, we don't hear it rustling in the brush. We take the vibrations from two different sensing devices in our head, and then we triangulate it, and then we guess what's going on over there. We project it over into that place in our head. And if you study the development of humans and of animals, and you see the cruel experiments that scientists do in the name of knowledge, you see how you can actually, developmentally, you can shape the way a person or an animal perceives by just changing a little bit of the development system or the track. If you take a baby kitten and through a critical part of its development, just a little window, you only show it vertical stripes, it won't be able to perceive in the horizontal dimension because it just didn't develop it. Okay? So we're projecting all of this stuff out. So if we can't perceive a lot of it, and we're projecting a lot of it, what else is going on that we don't know about? And what else is going on is this thing that we're going to call self-deception. If we can only have one thought in our conscious mind at a time, and we can process a bunch of other things unconsciously, and we've got more and more information coming at us at all times, not just the billions of photons that are coming in at any second that we've got to sort out and all the vibrations, but all the higher levels of information, of meaning, of relationships between us and others, and who's on my team and who isn't, and who am I going to mate with, and who wants to mate with me, and who am I going to be able to do business with, and how am I going to create security, and all the world's changing, and somebody's calling me on my cell phone, and I got a bunch of emails, and I got to watch TV tonight because my favorite show's on. How do we sort that out? Well, we sort it out with a set of tools. Okay, we sort it out with a set of tools that are relatively predictable and consistent in a human being. We're going to talk about them later as we get into the program, but for now, what I want to give you is a very important insight that I got from Daniel Goleman, who wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence that you've probably heard of. It's a very famous book. Well, he wrote a book before that I think is very profound called Vital Lies, Simple Truths. And it's all about self-deception. And self-deception is fantastic in that what it does is it blocks out certain information, it generalizes and stylizes other information, it gives us like a little peephole into reality, and this is the bonus, it covers its own tracks as it's doing it. It's like the blind spot in the eye with the Photoshop, the little smudgy finger that you use to fill in the thing on there. It's doing this the whole time. So not only is it working so we're deceived, so we don't see what's coming in, but it's also covering up the fact that it's doing it. So everything appears like, oh, no, that's really the way my hand looks. And someone says, I see it a different way. You go, come on, I'm looking at it, it's right here. And you don't detect all of the mechanisms that are smudging the picture. You don't see this whole thing happening. Back to the plane on autopilot, doing its thing, really kind of running the show. And then the final thing that I'll remind you of here as we kind of make this next transition is that we also have a mechanism that we might call the storying mechanism or the narrative mechanism, that while this is all happening is rewriting, reintegrating, reformulating all of it into a coherent narrative, one story that all makes sense and that usually keeps us right and good. And if anyone's going to be incorrect or bad, it's going to be someone else out there. That one is such a profound mechanism. I just have unending appreciation for it, for the storying or the narrative mechanism. Okay. So we have these senses. The senses are taking in signals, and then we're projecting reality out there. And we think it's real, and it's based on these small bands of vibration, essentially, and of energy that we can perceive. Most of it we cannot perceive. Then within those, we're leaving most of the information out that's even coming in. And then from there, we're deceiving ourselves. Okay, we've got all these mechanisms in place that are reshaping and reforming what is getting in. And then whatever does get in, we've got a mechanism that writes a whole story about it and tells it to us real time. It's a big challenge. One of the modern writing techniques that apparently started with the series several years ago that started Lost was the writers would write an episode and they wouldn't know what happened after that. So they'd write the episode and they'd make it, and then after the episode was over, they'd come back and they'd write the next episode. So the whole thing was unfolding in their minds real time. And it was completely engrossing when it came out. I mean, everybody got addicted to it because it had this air of anything could happen and everything keeps reformulating and recontextualizing. So there's something that has a lot of immediacy. It's very engaging to live in one of these realities where everything is changing meaning and it's all being woven into this new narrative, and whatever shows up somehow gets to fit in, as weird as it could seem. Well, we each get one of those ourselves. We have one that's running in here. And our mind is this collection of internal organs that are working together to create this one experience that to us seems like one toy. Okay, so Dr. Woodsmall is going to come and he's going to teach you kind of a powerful model, teach you kind of about some of these systems and how they work, and help us to really get a foothold into them, right, so that we can start using them with a little bit more intention. And he's also going to teach us a couple of techniques and approaches